Hey friends, welcome back to another episode of Going Nuclear with Osama. Here, I'm joined here with a very special guest, Lawrence Jones. Lawrence is Senior Vice President of International Programs at the Edison Electric Institute. So Lawrence, welcome.
Thanks for having me. So EEI was founded about 90 years ago. It's headquartered in Washington, D.C. We represent all investor-owned utilities in the United States. We also established about 30 years ago an international program that I lead. That program today has about 60 to 70 members around the world that have operations in 90 countries, including in Canada. We provide public policy advice. We work with organizations around things like how to attract investments to the sector. We talk about some of the critical issues that are facing the industry from a public policy standpoint, and everything ranging from supply chain, workforce development, the energy transition, making sure you have the right investment, coming to the sector around technology. So literally the entire value chain. And one of the things we do at the international program, our membership, you don't have to be an investor-owned utility. You can be a utility anywhere along the value chain. And that means we have a very good grasp of what's happening around the world when it comes to the electricity sector.
Nice. No, that's great. It's great to know how large of a footprint Edison Electric Institute has, and your stakeholders there. Tell me a little bit about the impact you want to make being a leader at this institute.
Well, one of the things Thomas Edison is known to have said, or is believed to have said, because I don't know if he actually said it, maybe he did, I wasn't there. But there's a thing he has said, and we have that as our slogan at EEI, and that is, who you are, we're showing what you do. Before I joined EEI, I had worked for a number of technology companies in the energy sector. When I did my doctorate at the Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden, my life was all about technology. And then a couple of years ago when EEI came knocking on my door, it was a different sort of a kind of a world, going from selling technology, more or less, or advocating for technology, to now looking at advocating for public policy. And I always wanted to do something bigger, because my father, who, as I mentioned when we were having a conversation, himself was an engineer. He worked, ran one of the leaders at the utility in Liberia and West Africa. And we've had a lot of conversations, before he died around making a difference in whatever you do. And from the electricity side, I thought, whatever I can do to help to bring more electricity, or to help to create the opportunities for more electricity to be brought around the world, that would be a great mission. And being at EEI, the platform we have allows us to do just that in terms of working with utilities all over the world, helping them or working together with them to identify the right mechanisms, the right public policy, the right investment opportunities for them to scale up electricity, so that this marvel of electricity can be brought to everyone on the planet.
That's incredible. It seems like accessibility is something that is really important to you,
Yes.
right? And it seems like you're really passionate about innovation as well. So could you tell me a little bit about innovation and what that means to you?
So for me, innovation is central to our industry. In fact, several years ago, I gave a talk in New Zealand where I talked about what I call the invisible innovation. Because everyone watching this podcast has one thing at home, a light bulb. And that light bulb, when they flip a switch, they expect that light bulb to glow. Now, what they never ask themselves is, what makes the light bulb glow? And that's where innovation sits. You don't see it because you see the result of the innovation. I always use the analogy of people see innovation as solving a problem as opposed to just having a technology. Well, a lot of the innovation that goes into the energy industry, in the electricity sector, there are things you cannot touch or feel. Give you an example. Right now, as we and I sit here, there could be a certain event on the grid in Canada that would require the linesmen and engineers on the field to make certain serious decisions about saving the grid. Those decisions involve a lot of gut instinct, a lot of on-the-spot decision making, right? Well, what is innovation? Innovation is that aha moment. So these men and women do a lot of things to keep the lights on. They make a lot of decisions that if we could package those decisions into a product, it would be unimaginable. So the innovation that what drives me, what I've been doing for most of my career, is not just looking at the technology, everything from the buzz, quantum computing, artificial intelligence. That's great. Those are important innovations that brings together this idea of the smart grid. The other innovation that I'm passionate about are the things that are not written down on paper, the things that are in the heads of the engineers, the linesmen, the people in the bucket truck. Those are the innovation that I find so fascinating. And so for me, innovation, I think it's all about what we do as an industry, but we are not good at telling that story. And that is one of the things I am very troubled about, is that in spite of all the innovation that this industry does, there is a perception that this is not an innovative industry.
Yeah, so let's pull on that thread a bit. The perception of public perception versus the perceptions versus the reality of what's going on in the industry. Could you tell us a bit about that distinction and kind of that gray area?
It is indeed a gray area, as you say, Osama, because part of the problem is when you've taken something for granted for a long time, you flip the switch, the lights come there, right? You assume that everything is well. But oftentimes, even when that switch goes up and the lights come on, you may not see it, but there's a lot of innovation that goes on behind it. Now, part of the reason why the perception of this industry has not been innovative is because, one, in countries where you have access to electricity 24/7, you think that this industry is innovative. In countries where you have no access to electricity, you realize that this is an innovative industry. So part of the challenge is we've done a very good job as an industry in maintaining high levels of reliability in many parts of the world, especially the developed world. And as we now look at innovation, and the perception is when the lights go off, everyone wants the utilities, or the electric companies, as we also call them. But when the lights are always on, it becomes an afterthought. And so the challenge we have with the storytelling and the perception is, how do you make something relevant all the time, as opposed to it being relevant only when it's not there? And that is the question. Now, let's take, for example, your smartphone. Your smartphone is always in your pocket, 24/7 for the most part. And because of that, every new gadget you see on that smartphone makes you aware of what it's doing. Well, once you leave this building and there is no need to switch on the light, life goes on. But what you don't know is that the servers that are feeding the data from the data centers in different parts of Canada into your home, or into your iPhone or your smartphone, or the other smartphones, because I don't want to put commercials, so if I'm going to call iPhone your Samsung, let's call everybody, or your Apple phone, all the different smartphones, right? My point is, the innovation is being done. The perception is because sometimes reality doesn't match up. And how we do it, coming back to storytelling. We need to take every opportunity to explain, not to say that, we're shying away from the places where we need to do better, but think about it. For this engine, and I call it an engine, to work 24/7, given all the gadgets behind, all the different generator stations you guys have in OPG, the coordination, just the coordination alone is in and of itself an innovative work that has to get done. So we need to do a better job in telling the story. The discrepancy between reality and the perception is in part because depending on how long you've had access to electricity, you tend to take it for granted. And when you take something for granted, it's hard for you to see the ingenuity and the innovation. But things are changing. As we talk about the energy transition, as we talk about dealing with severe, critical, extreme weather, people are beginning to realize that keeping the lights on is not a trivial task.
Yeah, absolutely. The taking for granted piece definitely hits home, especially in developing nations like, here in Canada, which is very energy-rich nation. Tell me a little bit about right now with energy crisis internationally going on, and supply chain issues. People are starting to understand that this is an asset which we shouldn't be taking for granted, right? Across Europe and across a lot of developed nations. So are we at a turning point here?
Well, one would hope that we are. I think, there's a saying that you should never miss the opportunity that a crisis presents. It's sad what has happened in the world because of the financial hardships that a lot of people are facing. I think clearly affordability must always remain a priority for essential service as electricity. And I think the industry globally, and this is not one specific country, as I travel around the world, more and more executives are very, very much focused on the importance of balancing this tripod. And the tripod is we want affordable electricity. We want clean and increasingly sustainable and clean electricity. We want resilient, reliable electricity. Those three things have to be balanced. How you do it, it's not an easy feat, especially when you have so many different moving parts you have to balance out. So hopefully, as we look at the challenges around supply chain, we look at these challenges around just dealing with critical minerals that are necessary for the industry, when we look at the choices that governments have to make regarding affordability, accessibility, reliability, we could be at a turning point where it would be recognized that there is no silver bullet. I hate to use bullets, but there is no silver bullet. There has to be several multitudes of ideas brought to bear, and it comes into this issue around supply. There has to be a realization that the world, as complex and as expansive as it is in terms of size and population, have to be realistic and pragmatic about how we provide electricity to everybody. And so that brings me to this whole notion around fuel diversity, diversity of supply. I don't like people who are dogmatic or who are sort of binary in their choices, right? Either or, right? Several years ago, it was either centralized or decentralized. Well, no, you need both, right? Depending on the context. The same as it comes to the fuel source. You need, in terms of renewables, you need renewables, but you also need nuclear. And nuclear is fossil-free, and so it should be definitely part of the equation. You have other sources. You have geothermal. You have now you're even talking about fission and fusion. They're all coming. So I think we need to take a holistic approach in dealing with the crisis, but we also should come out of the crisis recognizing that even as we transition the energy system, we have to do it in a way that is adhering to those requirements of affordability, resilience, reliability, and sustainability. And that means we need to use all our potential resources we have. In some countries, the local context will determine. So some countries are vastly blessed with having access to natural gas. Natural gas is playing a very critical role in many parts of the world. And the same has to do with nuclear. And I think you saw in Germany, you've seen a reversal of public policy around that. You saw in Japan a reversal of public policy. I think what makes me very optimistic and hopeful, Osama, is look at the trajectory curve of technology. So the price curve, when you look at a small modular reactor, it could start going down significantly. Long duration storage, that could also go down. There is hope, but I think the bigger challenge is, are we as humans in the society, are we prepared to transition ourselves, our lifestyles, our choices? We can transition the energy system all we want. If we don't transition how we are as humans and how we relate to one another, we're not going to be able to deal with the crisis we face.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate your perspectives on the different layers and actually showing how complex, but also how simple this topic is, right? And how there's not necessarily only the technology element, but there's also the people side of things as well. Tell me a bit about the Edison Electric Institute and and the change it's looking to make in that sphere when it comes to all of these challenges. Yeah.
So several years ago, EEI really leaning on the idea of, making sure we have a smarter energy infrastructure, that we have a cleaner energy infrastructure, and that we'll also focus on this issue around resilience. And so, there are a couple of things that EEI, as a body of organization of utilities around the world, both domestically and internationally, have been focused on. The first thing is, in North America, for example, let's just stay here for a while, there's this notion of this concept called mutual assistance. What is it? What it is whenever there is a crisis in terms of environmental, maybe like an earthquake or bushfire or wildfire or severe storm. It's amazing to see how utilities from all across North America, electric companies, come together, send crews from different parts of North America to help. It's almost like a brotherhood, a sisterhood of electricity workers coming together to put the lights back on. It's a fantastic thing to see, very moving. And we saw that during Superstorm Sandy, for example. We've seen it in many other storms across the U.S. and in Canada as well. And that notion of mutual assistance is what it's called. It's extremely important. We've now expanded that concept where we now talk about not just mutual assistance from a physical standpoint, but even in terms of cybersecurity, where there are activities where utilities are beginning to share lessons around how to protect the grid from cyber attacks and that. I think the other area where EI is leaning in heavily in terms of the energy transition is we were one of the, in fact, I think perhaps the only organization as an association that actually invested time and money and effort into establishing an ESG template. So we worked with some of the different rating agencies. My colleague, and some of my colleagues, led by one of our senior vice presidents, my colleague Richard McMahon, and his team worked together with the industry, and were able to come up with a template that is now being used by more and more organizations to basically report what they're doing to deal with the ESG compliance and what have you. The other area, I definitely have to mention that because it dovetails into some of the other things we've talked about, is the industry is recognizing the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think that is extremely important at a time when the workforce issue, and I know you're smiling because you want to get back and talk about the workforce and talent attraction to the industry, is extremely important. And so one of the things you do when you want to deal with diversity, equity, and inclusion is to make sure you are recruiting people that reflect the communities that you serve, right? And I think not just at EEI in the US, but I see it in Australia, New Zealand, wherever we have members I've traveled, more and more are leaning into having their workforce reflect their community. And I think it's going to be extremely important at a time when we need to recruit and attract young people to our industry at a rate that we've never even thought of before. And that is something I think. So those three things, the ESG area, in the area of mutual assistance and the diversity, equity, and inclusion. I mean, those are just three I would highlight. But I mean, there are many, many other areas where I think as an industry, both domestically and internationally, we're coalescing and working together. Everything will have a different implementation approach because, countries are different. But if you take the inclusion part, I was having a conversation with someone earlier today regarding OPG and the work you're doing with your indigenous communities, right? Fascinating story. Well, if I took the same idea from here and went to the US, I would have a conversation on what would be referred to as environmental justice. Or if I fly over to Europe, I'll have the same conversation around what is probably referred to as the just transition. So different words, different phrases, but conceptually, they're all headed in the same direction.
I think the ED&I topic and the workforce, that's another challenge, right? And something that we need to improve in utilities across the world, right? And you gave examples of Australia, in Europe, and throughout North America as well. So tell me a bit about that change in the workforce, right? I know it's going to be, we're going to need more more people joining the energy industry and fast, right? We need more electricity, electric cars, electrification of industries are going on. So tell me a little bit about that challenge.
So I think the challenge didn't start today. We're seeing an evolution of the challenge of attracting people to the workforce that dates back probably 30 years ago. And I say that because when I was working on my PhD, I remember having a conversation with my brother. So he went into IT and I went into ET, and I would joke with him and say, your IT will not work without my ET. But for some reason, his IT was perhaps more attractive and more people went into IT. But I think it is also because ET is not as simple. I'm not saying IT is not complex, but ET is a little bit more complicated in terms of the amount of things you have to do, right? You can't just learn how to code with ET. You need to know some fundamentals. With IT, you can get away with just coding and become a coder. With ET, you still need to know some physics. You still need to know some basic chemistry. You need to know some calculus. So in essence, the fields are different, right? The challenge facing our industry now for those decades that have passed is that we did not expose the younger generation to all the things that go on behind keeping the lights on, all the interesting things, right? I mean, if you think about it, every major technological, not everyone, but most technological innovation that's out there today, you can find it being applied somewhere in our industry. Whether you go from quantum computing, artificial intelligence, things around, the use of even, virtual reality. There are lots of things there, right? And so today, drones are used in our industry in ways that most people wouldn't even realize, right? Now, how do you then tell the story about the attractiveness of this industry in that you're not just going to be working, say, in a mine or working on the field. Now, don't get me wrong, you need both. You need people working on the field because at the end of the day, even if you have robots, you still need trained, well-educated technicians and others who can maneuver the disconnect, who can climb in the bucket truck and go up there and play around with this transformer to bring the lights back on. So what we need to do as an industry, and we're doing it now, there's progress being made. I was in Europe last week talking to a couple of utilities in Spain and in Italy, and they've invested millions of euros in building up the workforce. In fact, one of them said they had trained about 6,000 people since the pandemic, right? Oh, wow, yeah. So you're seeing changes happen in terms of making the industry, more attractive. And I think the last point I will make on the workforce issue is we need to also show as an industry a career pathway. That what does it mean to work in the electricity industry? You have to explain so that people see that I'm going to go from A to B to C, And the last point, coming back to this issue around sustainability and ESG, right? The beauty of this industry is that as we evolve, so do the jobs, right? 20 years ago, there was no chief sustainability officer in this industry. Today there is. 20 years ago, there was no chief human resource officer. Today there is. Now, that means that the industry is actually trying to keep in touch with the time, but we still need to get out there, proactively attract and recruit young people, not when they're in high school, when they're in elementary school, right? The last point I will make, and you'll find this interesting, I have 3 kids. A daughter who's 12 and my 2 sons, they're twin boys, 7 years old. And for the longest time, they never understood what I did for a living. Right? In fact, the boys would joke and say, all Daddy does, he travels around the world, he gives speeches, and he talks to people, right? And so I've been trying to spend more time trying to get them to understand the complexity of what I do. And not just what I do, but what everyone in this profession does, is that for that light bulb to glow, there are so many different things behind that needs to happen. Public policy, investments, maintenance, asset management, planning, operations. I mean, there's a whole slew of things that must happen there just for one light bulb to glow. And my hope and I'm sure they're going to watch this so they can hear it, the more I can convince them and help them to understand the complexity, maybe, just maybe, 10 years from now, one of them may find their pathway back into the electricity industry.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I definitely hope that this conversation inspires them. You know, one thing that you pointed out was storytelling, right? And the power of storytelling. So tell me a little bit about that. Stories can create huge movements, huge shifts in society, which can inspire a lot of people. How can we incorporate some of that element into convincing people and attracting new talent?
You know, one of the things that I think we've forgotten as an industry is that the things we do have an impact on people's lives. But we're sometimes too shy to talk about what we do in the context of people's lives. And so we always talk about electricity, oftentimes, not we always, but many times people do, in the abstract, in terms of they don't show the faces, they don't show the impact, right? And I think storytelling going forward has to be so that, you know, during the pandemic, people realize the importance of supply chain. Supply chain issues have always been there. But it wasn't until the pandemic that it became apparent how important it is. When the lights go off anywhere in the world, it becomes apparent to everyone in that nation, country, city, wherever, the importance, right? What I think we need to do as we tell the industry story, both to attract young people, but also to satisfy the expectations of everybody or those who expect us to do certain things, is we are proactively telling the story. That we tell the story before the crisis, not after the crisis or not during the crisis, right? And that we are also open and ready to be corrected when we make mistakes. This industry has, I mean, we contribute so much to the world. In fact, I always say the world will stop without electricity. Okay, the world, as you know, will stop electricity. And then you would say, well, and I think you and I were discussing this before we got on the set. You know, you were saying, well, in spite of that, why is this electricity industry not considered to be as appealing? And part of the reason is because we haven't done a good job in showing why it is so appealing. And you will see it when you see how, when a mother is about to have a baby in the clinic in Liberia, because I have an image from a video that was done a couple of years ago, and the doctor was looking for somewhere to give this woman an IV. And he was using the light from his cell phone to identify where he would put the needle to give her IV. Now think about that. And if that light bulb or light from that cell phone was all of a sudden converted to a room of lights, what it would mean in the chances of saving her life. That for me, and I still carry that image in my mind yet even today, that for me is the power of electricity. Saving lives, right? Not only when it's gone, but even just that little light bulb alone. Imagine if you could scale it up. And so part of what I think is so fascinating about your question in terms of, you know, what we do and the importance of what we do is also, engineers are generally humble people. And I say generally because there are some who aren't. I won't call any names, but there are some who aren't. And because of our passion, we do everything, not me, because I'm not on the field, but the guys on the field and the girls, they do everything to keep the lights on, right? If you ever been to a control room and there is an emergency and the tension, it's almost like being in an emergency room in a hospital, because you got seconds to make a decision to avoid a blackout. And because that blackout could lead to the death of millions or thousands of people, not millions, but maybe thousands of people. An operator sitting in the control center anywhere in Canada today has that weight of responsibility on his shoulder. And I think those of us who are in the industry but not sitting in his seat or her seat need to tell their story, need to take the life of the control center operator and bring it in front of the average Canadian and say, by the way, when you flip that switch, that woman sitting in that chair all by herself, 24 hours, 24 by 7, in isolation, it's because of her that the flip works. And we saw it during the pandemic. I'm sure you guys did it in Canada. Control room operators where, they were isolated, stayed away from their homes. And do you realize, for the most part, and I checked this so far, I haven't been proven wrong, during the entire pandemic, across the world, there were maybe a few brownouts, but there was not a single major blackout during the first year of the pandemic, right? For me, that's a story that we need to tell. And not because we want to brag, but because of the sacrifice that those men and women had to do to stay in a control center away from their families just to make sure that the lights stayed on.
Lawrence, I love those examples, right? Those stories that you brought up, especially the woman in Liberia where, where a doctor has to use a cell phone flashlight to put an IV, right? And those, that's the message that I think folks in the developing world don't always resonate or don't experience
In a developed world.
in the developed world.
Yeah.
And I love how you brought that light bulb to life almost to show, hey, listen, here's a simple technology, but look at the remarkable impact it's making. So tell me about your experience sharing that story with folks here in the developing world then, and what change do you think it brings to the hearts and minds of people?
There is nothing so amazing you do this for a hobby, not for a living, because you're not a podcaster for a living, it's for a hobby. But I think people connect when they see the humanity in what it is that we do. And I've told this story oftentimes, and what I see on people's faces is almost like a wow, especially when I tell the story in the developed world. When I have these conversations in Africa and elsewhere where they don't have the same level of access, that's their day-to-day living. So they don't need me to tell them how important a light bulb is. If you've never experienced not having access to electricity, you can only relate to the story if one puts it in a context that you will feel. And I think most people, when I talk about the mother needing an IV, get it. Because there's one thing you can go wrong. If you poke the wrong place, you could die.
Yeah.
Right? And if the only source of light is your iPhone or your cell phone or your smartphone or whatever it's called, right? Think about that, right? And I think as we think about broadening this question, how people react, Thomas Edison has a saying which we remind ourselves at EA all the time. I think I said it earlier, who you are is showing what you do. Well, the same in terms of the stories you tell. I think we as an industry need to pick stories that relate to the real life of people. I've always said that imagine if you could do a Hollywood movie about the electricity industry. What would it look like, right? Now, most of the movies they've made so far, there's been one on blackouts, there's been one on the life of Edison and Westinghouse, But can you imagine a movie about the life of a linesman and what he does, and how during a storm, when we're sitting in the comfort of our homes, that gentleman or that lady puts on their gear, drives in the snow, and have to stand there and wait for the wind to subside, still in the cold, for them to climb up on a pole and do some maneuvering to be able to keep the lights on. But how do we show those people appreciation? How do we show them that we care? And I think we're in a service-minded industry, and we need to highlight why we're serving and the kinds of services we're offering. The light bulb will glow, the electrons will flow, but why is it flowing?
Yeah.
And why do we want it to flow? And what will happen if it stops flowing? And I think understanding, for me, I think the centrality of what we do as an industry is to empower lives and to save lives. And those two things, for me, is something I try to remind myself all the time, that even from where I sit, whatever I'm trying to do as I engage with utilities or electric companies around the world, if one crazy idea out of my head can help a utility to make a decision that will empower their citizens or enable them to protect lives, I may never know about it. But behind the scenes, I'm aware that that is being done. And I think that awareness of what it takes to keep the lights on and why what we do is so essential needs to be told, whether via Hollywood, whether via the equivalent to Hollywood in Canada. We need to tell the story. So for me, coming back to your original question about storytelling, it for me is so important that we tell the story of the industry, but we also need to do it fearlessly. And I say that because we need to be bold in terms of sometimes challenging conventional wisdom when it comes to people who say, and you said it during our conversation. You said this industry is not. You used the word. You say it's not sexy, and I said to you, I mean, we're on camera here. This is nothing crazy. I said, well, how much more sexier can we get? Because all of the cool things that are happening behind the scenes should want anybody to work in this industry. Because you can go from driving drones to working on 3D, to working on 3D printing, right? To working on, all kinds of, battery chemistry, small modular reactor, long duration storage. So all is there, right? We just need to package it up and just say, hey, this is the electric power industry. It is not just the wooden poles you see. There are a lot of other things happening behind the scenes, but people don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the examples that you gave. And what was going through my mind was, shows like Big Bang Theory and shows that bring kind of technology to the forefront that people can relate to. So I definitely think that's a really cool challenge. And, the idea of being bold and fearless, I think that's something that we're going to have to do eventually, right? Whether we like it or not, because that's the message. That's the messaging which resonates with people, right? And I think in our conversation we talked about how the public can kind of see through that as well, right? They can see how authentic you are, and what messaging works and what doesn't. So tell me a little bit about your experiences there with developing that messaging, that core messaging with these various groups, with your various stakeholders for EI. What feedback have you got from different organizations, and what are they what are they doing differently that hasn't been done before?
No, I think I think part of the issue about the storytelling, every organization has a different approach, right? I mean, the way you do it here at OPG will be different from the way they do it in Australia, and even in Australia, different utilities, different companies will do it differently, right? I think what is important is not so much of what they do that's different. I think what is most important is the thematic approach they take towards telling their different stories, right? And I say that because it's easy for the industry to be headed in different directions, right? But because we're one industry, you know, I always say electrons are politically agnostic. They flow to the path of resistance. Well, the ideas about electricity are also without national borders. So what you do in Canada to light up Canada will be seen around the world and will create curiosity. And people will ask questions. How do they do it at OPG? Well, guess what? That's the same question. How do they do it at a utility or electric company in the US? How do they do it in the street? Because guess what? It's the same thing that's flowing, electrons.
Yeah.
The question is, what makes them flow easier in one country compared to another country, right? So the messaging that has to happen in terms of how you talk about the industry, for me, it's always most effective when it's not necessarily tied to a country, a company, an organization, because I could lift up OPG from here, as effective as it may be here, and put it in another country, and it will be totally ineffective, right? So context matters.
And relevance.
Relevance matter. And so that's something I think is extremely important. So again, different companies doing it differently, they all have different approaches, but I think the key here is having that understanding of the themes that are necessary for our industry. So right now, a big global theme on everyone's mind, supply chain.
Yeah.
Right? Another big global theme, transition. Right? But how those themes are converted into practical actions on the ground would be very different. Understanding though the themes are very important. And then you have to, one of the things about my work at EI is that the challenge I face, which is also an opportunity, is that I get from OPG, I go to another member company in Canada, another member company in Australia, New Zealand, Africa. They all want to talk about supply chain, but they want to talk about it from their vantage point. And so the beauty of why I like my job, or why I like what I do, is the fact that, and that's what drives my passion, it's like I'm always learning how a different company is doing the same thing but a different way. And that for me it's a blessing.
Yeah, I love how your passion for learning, you know, it really came out during this conversation, right? You know, we spoke about so many different topics. You covered so many different topics like, you know, supply chain, workforce, the future of the energy industry, and really giving our viewers and listeners such incredible context into the challenges and also hope that we should have as an energy industry.
I just want to add another little tidbit I think is so important, given that I'm in Canada and given that one of the beauties of this industry is continuity. And what I find so fascinating is that this industry has the propensity to keep the lights on even through transition, right? And I mean, look at the fantastic job Ken has done after his predecessor, and look at the fantastic job his predecessor did after his predecessor. Well, with all due respect to Ken and his predecessor and his predecessor's predecessor, that continuity was because of the workforce behind them.
Yeah.
Right, and that for me is oftentimes what is neglected in the conversation about this industry, is all of the men and women who sacrifice time and effort because of their passion for keeping the lights on. So I really want to say that, because sometimes, you know, people who have the time to be in front of the camera, but again, all of this won't happen if Ken didn't have an army of dedicated people at OPG that allow the continuity. The leadership is needed, and that's what he brings to the table, but that leadership would only sustain itself because of the people that he has, you know, his executive team and yourself and others. So thanks again for having me, and you know, very, very much enjoyed this conversation. Wasn't planned, but we made it happen.
That's how the best conversations happen, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, no, great message, and I think this is something that the viewers will definitely enjoy hearing. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks.